Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I'm your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'm bringing you another author interview, this time with Ian Nathan, author of the upcoming book, Clint Eastwood, the Iconic Filmmaker and His Work. Before I jump into the interview, I'd love for you to subscribe to the show in your podcast player so you can get all the newest episodes as soon as they are released. If you like the interview and want to hear more, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and a review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. I'll read out some of the reviews on the next episode. Ian Nathan is one of the UK's best-known film writers. He is the author of Stephen King at the Movies, Ridley Scott, A Retrospective, and James Cameron, A Retrospective, and biographies of the Coen Brothers, Quentin Tarantino, and Wes Anderson. He is the former editor and executive editor of Empire, the world's biggest movie magazine, and a regular contributor to newspapers, magazines, and TV. He joins me today to talk about his new book coming out September 7th, Clint Eastwood, the Iconic Filmmaker and His Work. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned early on in your book that Eastwood could be considered a feminist filmmaker. I'd love for you to expand on that a bit if you could. What is it about his approach that could be considered feminist, especially since he's often seen as being incredibly macho in many of his roles?
Yeah, this seems like almost like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? Because when you mention Clint Eastwood, you think of Dirty Harry, you think of all the Westerns, The Man with No Name, you think of a very male icon. But if you think about him as a filmmaker, slightly aside from his starring roles, you do come across a pattern, certainly in, throughout the career, really, but a lot in the kind of first half of his filmmaking, where the female characters in his films are anything but ingenues. They're anything but sort of simpering love interests. Right. They're very complicated, often quite dark characters. You go back to the very first film he directed, Play Misty for Me, and it's a story of an obsessive woman who kind of obsesses on Eastwood's local DJ character. But she's drawn in vibrant, dark, and complicated colors. You know, she is not a simple character. Right. And I think that idea and that curiosity carries right across his films. They may not be the biggest parts in his films, but I don't think he ever portrays women as simple. In The Gauntlet, an early action movie, he really has a great female opposite him. And Sandra Locke obviously was in a lot of films with him at that time. But she is feisty and she is a rival. And in relation to the film, it was a cop movie about a guy, Eastwood's cop escorting Sandra Locke's hooker who's seen too much of a crime. Mm-hmm. And they're out to get her. And she's the better half of the double act. She's the brains of the outfit. And that's so Eastwood, of that time.
Excellent. Yeah. And I think we see that even throughout, with something like $1 Million Baby later on. Obviously, the turning point in that film, not to spoil it if anyone hasn't seen it, but what ultimately the Hilary Swank's character decides to do after her accident in the film, that's another role that could be pointed out there too, I think.
Oh, absolutely. $1 Million Baby in some ways sums up so much of what has been the Eastwood ethos in terms of characterization, in terms of the worlds he wants to explore. But never bringing a character to the screen, and very much this includes female characters who are one-dimensional. Right. Really opening characters up from what you expect them to be to something far more complicated. And, I know many people can argue against other ideas of what feminism might be, but I think there are striking female characters in his films.
Right. Yes. And you also mention in the book, I think it's a quote directly from Eastwood, that he said Westerns and jazz were the only true American art forms. So what do you think was it that drew him to those two types of artistic expression?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. He loved jazz naturally. He was a good musician. And at one point early in his life had really considered trying to become a professional pianist. Mm-hmm. He kind of knew, it's one of those things that he was good enough a musician to know he wasn't good enough. And I think that kind of realization was that he can never be one of the great jazz pianists, but he absolutely adored the form. And I think there is something inherent, and he knew that the relationship between America and jazz, that it represents something about the American psyche, just as the Western, in a sense, does. It's a kind of an American folklore, a kind of way of America to examine itself. And those two subjects are, get entwined in not just the kind of films that Eastwood has made. Of course, he's made many Westerns, but he has made in Bird a fantastic movie about jazz, but also the way he approaches films. That he does direct in a loose, kind of free-form, almost jazz-like manner, where there is plot, but character and tone and theme and feel can be more dominant than the driving force of story. And I think that counts for his Westerns as well. So I think, in the sense we think of Eastwood as a very American filmmaker, it's very tied up with these strong American art forms, that he was very dominated by them both.
Sure, for sure. Now, in reading the book, I was struck that Eastwood always seemed to be almost 2 steps ahead, kind of ready for his next challenge as he was finishing up one movie, but almost at the same time taking things as they came his way, the script landing at just the right time. Was that all luck on his part, or was he really carefully planning out his career as he went along?
I'm not sure he was sort of planning it out in a sort of a deliberate sense of, I'm going to do this genre, then I'm going to do this genre.
Right.
I need to make a hit here. I think those things were around in his head. He knew it was wise to be commercially successful because then he could carry on making films. So he wasn't immune to that idea. He's an artist who worked within the Hollywood system. But at the same time, he was very driven by the need to keep working. And, he never took a holiday. I don't know how many holidays he's ever taken. But, the next movie was the holiday. That need to be on set, the need to be working, to be making films was his life, in a sense. There was a private life and there were interests. He loves to golf. And of course, he loves his music and all those things. But filmmaking is the life rather than the job. So it was a very natural way, or process for him to have the next one ready to roll. And the other key thing, I think, with Eastwood is he's very unfussy as an individual and as an artist and a guy who works within the system. For some directors, it seems to be like they've got to think things through for years before they can choose the next project. They've got to go through this kind of agonized process. Whereas for Eastwood, it's like, I like the sound of that. Let's go for it. Let's get the script right. Let's move. Let's keep moving. And it's a kind of a Western ethos almost, riding to the next town. Sure. Constantly, the horizon draws you on. And I think he's just very good at making decisions quickly and simply and then figuring them out. Right. So the right script comes along, he kind of gets an inkling, he goes for it, trusts his instincts.
Yeah, and I think that comes out in I think you mentioned it a couple times in the book, working with Spielberg on the various scripts, that they decided on what they were going to do between the two of them over a drink or during dinner, and that was it. There was no fuss about it. They just moved forward and made the next movie.
They did. I mean, Flags of the Fathers, which was a book that Eastwood had read and immediately thought he could make a film out of it. Then he found out that Spielberg had the rights and had been sort of dallying around. The film had been made, and they met backstage. I think it was at an Oscars. And Eastwood just approaches Spielberg and says, "Hey, you got the rights to that book. How do I get them off you? How can I get them? How can I persuade you otherwise?" And Spielberg just went, "Well, why don't you do it and I'll produce it?" And Eastwood went, "Deal." And that was it. 7 seconds, I think he says. And in Hollywood terms, that's madness.
Right.
They could go through lawyers and all those kind of things have to come into play, and weeks have to go through for a decision. But that's Eastwood for you. And I think Spielberg liked that about him, that let's just get this movie made. Let's not talk about it. Let's do it.
Right. Now, what do you think, speaking of Spielberg, he collaborated a couple times with Spielberg as a producer, and obviously he's got numerous other collaborations. I'm thinking of all the movies he's made with like Morgan Freeman. What is it about those particular relationships that drove Eastman, and why do they work so well in his films?
Well, I think the art of collaboration is often in its simplicity. You want to work with people you can rely on. Mm-hmm. Behind the camera, Eastwood used the same cinematographers, and he often brought on, when one wanted to move on or retire, it was kind of the second assistant would be brought up. It was a family-like system. The same editors, often the same composers. He liked familiarity and liked familiarity. And they're people he can rely on. And, obviously in the wider sense, with Spielberg, he's a guy he can collaborate with and get films done and have the kind of canniness and power to get things done. So Spielberg's a good kind of collaborator for Eastwood. And I think someone like Morgan Freeman, it's just the flavor. It's just the quality that he knew Freeman would bring. And obviously with actors, it's a little more around, is the part right for them?
Sure.
What kind of role it is. So it's a little bit more particular. But when they came to make Invictus, that was a Morgan Freeman project that he brought to Eastwood. And he was the one who convinced his friend. So there was a kind of a toing and froing as well of information. But I think Eastwood likes that sense of family. He calls his units families. And I think the key to an Eastwood movie in terms of its production is, he can rely on people. He can go, right, that's my shot. And he knows his camera crew are going to get it for him. He's not going to overthink it.
Excellent. So in the book, you choose to set aside several individual chapters on some of the biggest films in Eastwood's career: Outlaw Josie Wales, Unforgiven, and $1 Million Baby, I think. And those are obvious milestones in his career. But were there any other films that had potential to be their own chapters as you were writing the book?
Yeah, this is kind of like, it's kind of a great question in the sense that, when you write a book, one of the things maybe people don't, realize from the outside is that certainly with a sort of coffee table style film book, is that you're given a word count, you're given a limit. It's not like I could write as many words as I want, because there is a kind of structure to the book in terms of how it's designed, in terms of how it's printed and made. So you have to work within constraints, and rather like a director will work within constraints of a running time.
Sure.
There's a little bit of kind of flexibility within that, but you have to stick to the number of words you're given. And with a career as long and as detailed and as successful as Eastwood's, that was a torture, because I wanted to do a full chapter on nearly everything.
Yeah.
And certainly early on in my planning, having not quite done the maths yet, I planned to do a full chapter on Play Misty for me, the first film, because I kind of wanted to sort of explore him, how he became a filmmaker. And I really wanted to do Mystic River as a full chapter, because I thought it's a fascinating Eastwood film where he's behind the camera, and obviously was very lauded at the time. The Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima I would have done together maybe as a chapter, because that's a great story. But you're kind of working with what you have in terms of the film book, and the ones I pulled out seem to say a lot about him. And they sort of summed up an Eastwoodness. Plus, they're probably the most revered ones in the end. Unforgiven, Josie Wales, and $1 Million Baby as the two Oscar winners.
Right.
And probably his first great Western in Josie Wales. So, I wanted to write loads more, honestly, but you have constraints.
Sure. Now, on the chapter in Unforgiven, you quoted Eastwood saying he would never consider himself to be the heir to John Wayne, being more interested in the darker side of the Westerns. How do you think that has defined the films he's made, both the Westerns and beyond?
Yeah, I think this is key. He's often spoken of as the kind of the successor to John Wayne, the holder of the flame in terms of that genre. When Eastwood started directing Westerns, certainly the genre as a whole in Hollywood had declined, and he was one of the very few able to get Westerns made, and that really was the truth throughout his career. But the kind of director he was of Westerns isn't like John Wayne, isn't really taking on that mantle. I think the only probably traditional Western Eastwood's ever been involved in is the television series Rawhide. Beyond that was when he was a very young man, doing his first major role. And he was kind of a bit of a square, Rowdy Yates, the character he played on television. But the key to this, I think, is the relationship he had with Sergio Leone with the spaghetti westerns, which he went over to Spain, and he made these very cheap, it seemed at the time, but fantastically, gloriously operatic, but ironic westerns that explored the traditions, explored the mythology, while telling their own story. They got to have it sort of both ways. They got to be statements on the Western and still be Westerns, of which the man with no name, the Eastwood character, was integral. He was his outlaw. He was amoral, but he was tremendously charismatic, and it was drawn toward him. And he had this rather sort of I don't know, dismissive way with what the kind of the world he was in. Yet somewhere at the core of him there was a kind of moral sensibility, and I think Eastwood does it tremendously well. And I think he was very affected by that in terms of the westerns he wanted to make and the way he wanted to explore America.
Mm-hmm.
And although he's not spoken of in these terms very often, Eastwood is a 70s filmmaker. He started at the end of the 60s to direct, but the body of his work is 70s, obviously, then on into, throughout the following decades. But 70s, as we know, were defined by a kind of, exploration of genre, exploration of tradition that all these filmmakers, including Scorsese and Spielberg and Coppola and De Palma and all those guys, the movie brats, came in and sort of took what were the Hollywood traditions and completely threw them in the air and came up with something brand new. And I think to an extent, Eastwood is part of that. Although he had a connection with the kind of the star traditions of the past, he had those sort of that side to him. You look at High Plains Drifter, you look at Pale Rider, you look especially at Outlaw Josie Wales. These are the early westerns that he made, and you have films that are dark, films that don't have heroic, white hat, black hat kind of sensibilities that really, I think, are in their own way commentaries on the birth of America and the shaping of America. And they were commentaries on what could be done with the Western, that you didn't have to stick to the John Wayne model, that you could say something quite brutal often about the nature of the times and funny. If you've watched Outlaw Josie Wales, it's a very funny film.
Sure, yeah.
And we get the culmination of that really with Unforgiven, which obviously made in the 90s, but is an extraordinary exploration not only of the genre, not only of the way the genre has been made and the landscape, if you want, of the Western, but a commentary on Eastwood's place in that itself. It's almost like an absolutely concentrated, ironic exploration of his place as the successor to John Wayne. And I personally feel he's not given enough credit for how daring a filmmaker he's been.
Sure. Now, I had to laugh at the end of the book. You mentioned that his current film, Juror Number 2, was announced as you went to press for the book. Obviously, this is being called his final film right now, but do you think he's ever going to really retire, or is he going to be working until the day he's no longer with us?
I think that might be the case. You write this book and you think, well, he's 91, 92 as you write it, and you think maybe, and Crying Macho was quite a warm and sort of gentle way to go out with Eastwood in front of the camera again and looking old, but set against this lovely sort of desert landscape. It was kind of a fine way to say farewell. And of course, brought a nice conclusion to the book. Mm-hmm. But of course, as soon as you're editing and you're getting it ready to send to the printers, I should have known that Eastwood doesn't retire. He's not interested in, he moves on. And fantastically, at the age of 93, he's currently directing another film, a courtroom drama. And I don't know whether he'll ever stop. I think, his mortal coil departing might have to be the only thing that stops him. He is frail now. He is a very old man. But I saw the pictures of him on set, and he's still Clint Eastwood, and it's fantastic. And it sort of says something almost. It was also quite a nice, looking on it, a nice way of ending the book by going, well, I thought this was it, but no, it isn't. He's still going. You can't put a good man down. He will carry on.
Exactly. Excellent. Well, you had a few references at the end of the book, but were there any specific books or articles or anything that people should check out if they enjoyed your book and want to learn even more about Eastwood?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there is a fantastic depth of writing and sort of analysis that comes with Eastwood. I mean, he is an icon in every sense. One of the most famous movie stars alive and one of the most famous Hollywood figures alive. Dirty Harry translates in third world countries in Africa as it translates in Europe. You know,
Right.
he's like a brand, like Coca-Cola. Far more interesting than Coca-Cola, but you know him everywhere. Richard Schickel, the critic and friend of his, wrote a very good biography of him, really in depth, where he tried to make sense of the Eastwood character and the controversies and the fascinations that come with it. There's a tremendous collection of interviews I used, just called Clint Eastwood interviews, which cover his directing career, which is really, really good. Mm-hmm. There's just lots of terrific stuff out there. You know, it was almost like daunting at the beginning when you start to do your research, you start to build a picture up of the story you want to tell. And you think, wow, there's just, you know, he's drawn fascinating commentary out of people and yet remained an enigma. I like that about him, is you don't quite know him. And the kind of the aloofness is still there.
Great. Now, I have a couple questions not specifically related to the book, but before I move on, is there anything else you want to touch on about the book itself?
No, that's great. No, it's it was a joy to write, I have to say. And I was kind of like, I've never tackled a subject that's had such a long career before. My previous books have been sort of younger directors, so it's only relative to Clint Eastwood, when the career might amount to 10, 15, 20 films. And suddenly you're dealing with 40-something films and watching a lot of work. That's fascinating. And it's so interesting to sort of chart that course through a lot of films. And a certain sense, I think, what I got from it was that not only do you get the story of Clint Eastwood, you get a story of Hollywood. You get the way the film world has changed around him. But he's remained this kind of father confessor figure, this kind of pillar on which the whole of the industry rests. Like, as long as Eastwood is there, we can kind of believe in ourselves. We've got a credibility because he's done that and lasted, that we can look to him and go, yes, Eastwood is here. And I think when he does finally pass, that's a huge thing. You know, there are very few people like that in Hollywood where you think, so it's the passing of a god almost. And he would never think of himself in these grand terms.
Right.
He's a very humble man. But I think it'll be the passing of an era. And when I say the word icon, I think that's, you know, I think Hollywood has relied on him in a ways to make sense of things. He's like the kind of the bellwether in which they check that things are okay.
Right.
And that's been a fantastic thing.
Wonderful. So now this might be the hardest question I ask. You've obviously watched a lot of films over your career and in your research for this book, but if you had to pick only three, your top three, what would they be?
Of any
film. That doesn't have to be just
not just Clint Eastwood. Oh, this is so hard. And I kind of often say when people say, "Oh, what's your top tens?" and top, for me, often it's a bit like music when, you know, it's a mood thing. And I mean, what I do is I recall films I come back to a lot, and I don't know whether these are my best three, but they're films that mean a lot to me. I've watched and written about and pondered and still been left haunted by Blade Runner since the day I first saw it, about the age of 11 or 12 in the cinema. Came out very perplexed, but it's never left me.
Sure. And
I can still, you know, put on that opening sequence and just be in awe of the kind of the environment of that film. It still is glorious. Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas is just a stunning piece of work that breaks my heart and shows me, we're talking about the commentary on America. It's a fabulous film made by a German about America and the landscapes and people and complexity of America. And few have got that close to what that film does. Yeah, it has something elusive in it that I can't quite describe. I don't, it's about relationships, but it's so much more than that. And I love the Coen Brothers Miller's Crossing because it's just this texture and it's this script that is just like it's so perfect and so measured and so clever that it delights me. That's three, but there are many more. Sure. I love Spirit of the Beehive. I love The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I love E.T. So movies have been my life. So there are many, but I'll give you those three for now.
Perfect. We'll take those three for now. Now, a little bit more fun question. If you could invite any three movie characters to your next dinner party, who would they be and why would you invite those folks?
Oh, characters is hard. I often think about who would I, if I had a magic wand, who would I bring back? And I always think of like Alfred Hitchcock, John Candy, probably Grace Kelly. I imagine, just they make the world better. Movie characters for dinner party. I mean, a lot of the characters I love would probably be quite poor dinner party guests because they're kind of dark individuals. I adore Grace Kelly. So Grace Kelly, just to look at her and sit beside her, Grace Kelly from Rear Window is so astonishing. She's like sort of glows.
Yep.
I would certainly have her there. I would have, I go back to those favorite films. Maybe I don't know, Harrison Ford as Deckard. He would be a bit sullen, I think. You want the kind of bon viveurs. Peter Ustinov as Nero would probably be more fun. Those. Who are those kind of great, fascinating, kind of brilliant characters? Pacino in The Godfather would be amazing.
Sure.
Maybe if you just kind of want to throw safety to the wind, why not bring Frank from Blue Velvet and, and just see what happens.
Yeah. Create an interesting dinner, that's for sure.
Yeah, everyone's going to be out and their nerds.
Yep. Now, do you have any books that you could recommend that you've read recently, be they other nonfiction or fiction, anything like that?
I do have books. People ask me what film books I always recommend. There's a brilliant book that I just loved and sort of remain a bit kind of in awe of. It's a book called City of Nets. It's by a guy called Otto Friedrich, who though he sounds German, was an American. And it's just about Hollywood in the 40s and the great talents that arrived from Europe, exiled by Nazi Germany. And it's a brilliant depiction of Hollywood in the 40s. So beautifully written. It's really fast paced. It's like a thriller in itself. And in fact, a lot of the Coen Brothers, Barton Fink, was based on City of Nets. They used that as a sort of a basis for their Hollywood. So many good books. I'm looking at my shelf here and saying, well, what else can I recommend? There's actually a book I think should always be read is Stephen Back's Final Cut. Stephen Back was an executive at United Artists when Heaven's Gate nearly broke the studio, pretty much did break the studio. Mm-hmm. And he was the guy running the whole project. And he's a beautiful writer. And it's a fabulous book about being in the studio. It's a fabulous book about genius out of control, about what an artist should or shouldn't be allowed to do. And it's just a great book about Hollywood in the 70s and the end of that great era. So I'd recommend that heartily. It's just something you must read. It's really easy to read as well. It's just thrilling and funny and interesting. So those two.
Excellent. I'll make sure to add those to the show notes for folks. And lastly, before we wrap things up, I know you're just finishing this book. It's going to be published soon. But what projects do you have lined up next? Do you have any other directors that you're going to be looking at?
I've got another book coming out on David Lynch sort of about a month after Clint Eastwood, which is a very different subject entirely, but equally fascinating, equally a remarkable journey to have gone on. I'm writing a book right now about Mad Max and the legend of Mad Max and the creation of those 4 films and what they embody and the kind of chaos. And obviously, there's a 5th film to come. Mm-hmm. And again, I like the variety of doing things that are very different. I'm working on a documentary. I'm making a documentary about the film Aliens, the James Cameron sequel to Alien, interviewing all the cast and crew, and very different challenge. That's going to be out in spring of 2024. And it's great. It's kind of funny. When you do a film, you have to kind of unlearn things you do as a book.
Sure.
It's a different kind of mindset you have to have. So it's been interesting to sort of teach myself how to do things visually rather than on a page. But I keep busy.
It sure sounds like it. We'll have to hopefully have you back on to talk about one of those other books, or maybe even the documentary next year. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Excellent. Well, Ian, thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciated you being willing to speak with me and for sharing all the stories and information from the book on Clint Eastwood. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you again to my guest today, Ian Nathan. His newest book, Clint Eastwood, the Iconic Filmmaker and His Work, is out September 7th, and I'll have a link to where you can pre-order that in the show notes, along with links to the movies and books mentioned throughout the interview. The Oscar Project podcast is written and produced by me, Jonathan Eacherberg, with editing assistance from Joshua Eacherberg. Please be sure to come back for my next episode, where I will be speaking with Corin Shadmay about his graphic novel, Lugosi, The Rise and Fall of Hollywood's Dracula. Until then, I hope to see you at the movies.